There exists a wound that masquerades as virtue, a prison disguised as compassion, a trap so subtle that those who fall into it believe themselves to be walking the path of love. You who have clicked on this video, you who have felt the pull of these words, perhaps you already know what I speak of. Perhaps you have tasted the bitter truth that lies beneath what the world celebrates as sensitivity. Tonight, we venture into territory that few dare to map. Not the shallow waters where popular psychology splashes about with its easy answers and comfortable labels, but the deep currents where the soul meets its shadow, where empathy becomes entanglement, where the sacred act of feeling transforms into something far more dangerous. If you are here, it is likely because something in you recognizes the paradox. You give and give until there is nothing left, yet somehow you are always empty. You feel everything so deeply that you have forgotten what your own emotions taste like. You rescue and heal and nurture, yet you find yourself surrounded by those who seem to drain the very essence from your bones. This is not a coincidence. This is not bad luck. This is not your imagination, running wild in the darkness of overthinking. This is the architecture of codependence, and it operates according to laws as ancient as human consciousness itself. But let me be clear from the beginning. When I speak of codependence, I do not speak of weakness or moral failing. I do not speak of some modern syndrome to be diagnosed and medicated away. I speak of an archetypal pattern, a dance between souls that has been choreographed by forces far older than our understanding. It is a pattern that emerges not from choice, but from survival, not from character flaws, but from the deepest wounds of the human heart. The empath who falls into codependence does not do so because they are foolish or naive. They fall because they have been initiated into feeling by circumstances that demanded they become exquisitely attuned to the emotional weather of others. Perhaps as a child, they learned to read the storm clouds in a parent's eyes. Perhaps they discovered that their own needs were less important than keeping the peace, maintaining the balance, being the one who could absorb the lightning before it struck. And so they became what I call the emotional archaeologist, forever digging through the ruins of other people's inner worlds, hoping to uncover something that will make sense of the chaos. They developed what seems like supernatural sensitivity, an ability to feel the unspoken, to sense the shadow behind the smile, to know when someone is drowning even when they appear to be swimming. But here is where the trap reveals itself. This gift, this profound attunement to the suffering and needs of others, becomes the very mechanism by which they lose themselves. They become so skilled at feeling for others that they forget how to feel for themselves. They become so adept at carrying burdens that they no longer remember what it feels like to walk unburdened. The codependent empath lives in a world where their value is measured by their usefulness to others. They have learned, often through painful experience, that love is conditional, that acceptance must be earned, that their place in the world depends upon their ability to be needed. And so they create unconsciously a life where they are always indispensable, always the one who understands, always the safe harbour for those caught in emotional storms. But this is not love, though it wears love's clothing. This is not compassion, though it speaks compassion's language. This is a complex transaction, a psychological contract written in invisible ink, where the empath trades their authentic self for the illusion of connection, their personal truth for the comfort of being needed. Watch how this unfolds. The codependent empath enters relationships not as an equal, but as a rescuer. They are drawn to the wounded, the chaotic, the emotionally unavailable, not because they are masochistic, but because these relationships feel familiar. They feel like home. They activate the same patterns that once kept the empath safe, the same hypervigilance that once helped them navigate dangerous emotional terrain. And the wounded ones, they sense this immediately. Not consciously, perhaps, but the unconscious recognizes its match across any crowded room. They are drawn to the empath's light, yes, but not to bask in it. They are drawn to consume it, to feed upon it, to use it as fuel for their own unhealed places. This is not evil intent. This is simply the law of psychological gravity. Emptiness seeks fullness. Chaos seeks order. The unhealed seeks the healer. But here is the cruel irony. The more the empath gives, the more they are needed. The more they sacrifice themselves for others, the more others become dependent upon that sacrifice. They create the very dynamic they hope to heal. They become trapped in a pattern where their worth is tied to their willingness to disappear into the needs of others. I have seen this pattern repeat itself across generations, passed down like a family heirloom of pain. The grandmother who gave up her dreams to hold the family together. The mother who absorbed every emotional tremor in the household until she forgot she had emotions of her own. The daughter who learned that love means erasing yourself for the comfort of others. And in each generation, the pattern grows more sophisticated, more subtle, more difficult to recognize. The modern codependent empath often believes they are enlightened, spiritual, evolved. They speak the language of boundaries while living without them. They talk about self-care while practicing self-abandonment. They preach about authenticity while wearing masks so elaborate they no longer remember their own face. This is not hypocrisy. This is the deepest kind of unconsciousness, where the very words we use to describe healing become weapons of self-deception. The empath tells themselves they are helping, supporting, loving unconditionally. They do not see that their help has become enabling, their support has become codependence, their unconditional love has become conditional acceptance of being treated as less than they are. The trap is elegant in its simplicity. The more the empath gives without receiving, the more they prove to themselves that they are good, worthy, spiritual. The more they accept unacceptable behavior from others, the more they can tell themselves they are patient, understanding, compassionate. The more they sacrifice their own needs, the more they can believe they are selfless, evolved, holy. But the soul keeps score, and the body never lies. The codependent empath may convince their mind that this is the path of love, but their body tells a different story: chronic fatigue, anxiety that has no clear source, depression that feels like drowning in grey water, illnesses that seem to emerge from nowhere, as if the body is trying to force rest upon a spirit that has forgotten how to stop. These are not random symptoms. These are the language of a soul in rebellion, a psyche crying out for attention, a deep self that refuses to be ignored any longer. The body becomes the messenger that delivers the truth the mind cannot bear to acknowledge. You are dying to yourself. You are disappearing into others. You are becoming a ghost in your own life. And still, the empath often resists this truth. They have built their entire identity around being the helper, the healer, the one who can handle anything. To acknowledge that they are trapped in codependence feels like admitting failure, like confessing that their greatest strength is actually their greatest weakness. But this resistance itself is part of the pattern. The codependent empath has learned to fear their own needs, to distrust their own perceptions, to believe that self-focus is selfish. They have been trained, often from childhood, to prioritize everyone else's emotional reality above their own. And so when the truth begins to surface, when the cost of their patterns becomes undeniable, they often turn that same caretaking energy inward, trying to fix themselves with the same tools that created the problem in the first place. They read more books about healing others. They take more courses on how to help people. They develop more sophisticated ways of giving without receiving. They mistake self-improvement for self-awareness, personal development for authentic transformation. They polish their prison bars until they shine, but they remain imprisoned. The path out of this trap is not what most expect. It does not begin with learning better boundaries, though boundaries will come. It does not start with choosing different partners, though choice will eventually shift. It does not commence with self-care practices, though care for the self will emerge. The path out begins with a descent, a journey into the underworld of their own psyche, where they must confront not only their patterns but the wounds that created those patterns. They must face not only their codependence but the terror that lives beneath it, the primal fear that if they stop taking care of everyone else, they will be abandoned, rejected, left alone in a universe that does not care. This descent requires a courage that the world rarely recognizes, for it demands that the empath do the one thing they have been trained never to do. They must turn their attention inward. They must become curious about their own inner landscape with the same intensity they have always reserved for others. They must learn to listen to the whispers of their own soul with the same devotion they have shown to the cries of everyone around them. But this turning inward feels like betrayal at first. The codependent empath experiences a kind of spiritual vertigo when they begin to focus on themselves. Who am I when I am not needed? What do I want when I am not trying to fulfill someone else's desires? What does my own pain feel like when I am not carrying the weight of everyone else's suffering? These questions are not comfortable. They are not gentle. They slice through the comfortable mythology the empath has built around their identity. They reveal the hollow places where an authentic self should reside. They expose the truth that in learning to feel everything for everyone else, they have learned to feel nothing for themselves. I have witnessed this moment of recognition in countless souls who have sat across from me in the sacred space of therapeutic encounter. The moment when the empath realizes they cannot name a single desire that is truly their own. The moment when they understand that their opinions are actually careful calculations of what others want to hear. The moment when they discover that their emotions are so entangled with everyone else's that they cannot locate the thread of their own authentic feeling. This recognition is devastating. It is also liberating. For in that moment of seeing, the prison door begins to crack open. Not because the empath has found the key, but because they have finally acknowledged that they are imprisoned. The work that follows is not pretty. It is not inspiring in the way that spiritual transformation is often portrayed. It is messy and uncomfortable, and often deeply unglamorous. The empath must learn to sit with their own emotions without immediately trying to fix them or understand them or transform them into something useful for others. They must practice the radical act of selfishness that is actually self-preservation. They must learn to say no without explanation, to disappoint others without taking responsibility for their disappointment, to be misunderstood without rushing to clarify. They must discover that they can survive the withdrawal symptoms of being needed, the cold turkey of no longer being indispensable. This process often feels like dying, and in a sense it is. The false self that has been constructed around the need to be needed must die for the authentic self to be born. The identity that has been built on being useful must crumble for the identity that is built on being real to emerge. But the resistance to this death is fierce, not only from within the empath themselves, but from everyone in their orbit who has grown comfortable with the arrangement. Family members who have learned to rely on the empath's endless availability suddenly find themselves forced to face their own emotional weather. Friends who have used the empath as an unpaid therapist must confront their own inner chaos. Partners who have grown accustomed to having their every need anticipated and met must learn to articulate their own desires. The empath who begins to reclaim themselves often finds that they have been living in a house of cards, held together by their willingness to be the foundation for everyone else's stability. When they begin to withdraw that support, when they begin to claim space for their own needs and desires, the entire structure often begins to shake. This is when the accusations come. Selfish, cold, changed, different. The people who once praised the empath's selflessness now attack their selfishness. The very ones who once celebrated their endless giving now condemn their newfound boundaries. The empath discovers that they were not loved for who they were, but for what they provided. This revelation can be crushing. To realize that many of the relationships they cherished were actually transactional. To understand that their value to others was conditional upon their willingness to remain small, accommodating, available. To see that what they experienced as love was often simply appreciation for services rendered. Yet this painful awakening is also the beginning of freedom, for the empath can no longer pretend that giving themselves away is the same as being loved. They can no longer convince themselves that being needed is the same as being valued. They can no longer maintain the illusion that their worth is measured by their usefulness to others. The journey toward authentic selfhood requires the empath to develop what I call discerning compassion. This is not the indiscriminate empathy that feels everything for everyone, but the mature wisdom that can distinguish between their own emotions and the emotions of others. It is the ability to feel with someone without feeling for them, to witness pain without absorbing it, to offer presence without offering rescue. This discernment does not come naturally to the codependent empath. They must learn it like a foreign language, practicing daily the art of emotional differentiation. They must ask themselves constantly, is this feeling mine or theirs? Is this reaction coming from my authentic self or from my trained response to maintain harmony? Am I responding to what is actually happening or to what I fear might happen if I do not manage this situation? The development of this discernment is painstaking work. It requires the empath to slow down, to pause before reacting, to create space between stimulus and response. It demands that they learn to tolerate the discomfort of not immediately rushing to fix or soothe or manage. It asks them to sit with the radical possibility that others are capable of handling their own emotional weather. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of this transformation is learning to receive. The codependent empath has become so skilled at giving that they have forgotten how to accept. They deflect compliments, minimize their own needs, and feel uncomfortable when others try to care for them. They have learned to be the strong one, the reliable one, the one who never needs anything from anyone. Learning to receive requires a fundamental shift in identity. It means acknowledging that they have needs, that they deserve care, that they are worthy of love, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. It means allowing themselves to be seen in their vulnerability, their uncertainty, their humanness. This vulnerability terrifies the codependent empath because it has been their experience that vulnerability leads to abandonment. They learned early that their needs were inconvenient, their emotions were too much, their authentic self was somehow unacceptable, and so they learned to hide behind their caregiving, to disappear into their usefulness, to find safety in being indispensable rather than being real. But true intimacy requires vulnerability. Real connection demands authenticity. Genuine love asks for the whole person, not just the parts that are convenient or comfortable or useful. The empath who learns to show up as they truly are, rather than as who they think others need them to be, discovers a depth of connection they never knew was possible. This does not mean that all relationships survive this transformation. Many do not. The people who were drawn to the empath's endless availability often drift away when boundaries appear. The relationships that were built on the empath's willingness to be less than they are often crumble when they begin to claim their full humanity. This loss is part of the process. It is painful, but it is also purifying. Like a forest fire that clears away the undergrowth so new growth can emerge, the empath's journey toward authenticity often burns away relationships that were not built on solid ground. What remains are the connections that can withstand the truth, the bonds that are strengthened rather than threatened by honesty, the love that celebrates rather than fears the empath's wholeness. The empath who completes this journey does not become cold or unfeeling. They do not lose their gift of sensitivity or their capacity for compassion. Instead, they become something far more powerful. They become authentic. Their empathy becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. Their compassion flows from fullness rather than emptiness. Their love comes from strength rather than need. They learn to use their sensitivity as a tool rather than being used by it as a weapon against themselves. They develop what I call boundaried empathy, the ability to feel deeply without losing themselves in the feeling, to care profoundly without taking responsibility for outcomes they cannot control. They discover that true healing does not come from absorbing the wounds of others, but from tending to their own sacred injuries with the same devotion they once reserved for everyone else's pain. They learn that their gift was never meant to be a sacrifice, but a sanctuary, not a place where they disappear, but a space where they finally, fully appear. This transformation is not linear. It does not unfold in neat stages or follow predictable timelines. The empath who awakens to their codependence often finds themselves cycling through periods of clarity and confusion, strength and collapse, boundaries and boundarylessness. They may have moments of profound insight followed by days of falling back into old patterns. They may experience breakthrough only to find themselves once again enmeshed in the familiar dance of giving too much and receiving too little. This cycling is not failure. It is the natural rhythm of deep change, the spiral path that leads not upward in a straight line, but inward toward the center of authentic being. Each revolution brings the empath closer to their true self, even when it feels like they are moving backward. Each return to old patterns carries new awareness, new choice points, new opportunities to respond differently. The unconscious does not surrender its hold easily. It has invested years, sometimes decades, in the belief that survival depends upon being needed. It has woven intricate webs of identity around the role of caretaker, healer, rescuer. When the empath begins to dismantle these structures, the unconscious often responds with what feels like sabotage. Dreams of drowning, of being chased by faceless figures, of houses collapsing around them, anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, striking in moments when they finally dare to prioritize their own needs. Depression that whispers lies about their worth, convincing them that they are selfish, broken, fundamentally flawed. These are not random occurrences, but the death throes of a false self that refuses to die quietly. The empath must learn to recognize these symptoms not as evidence of their failure, but as proof of their progress. The unconscious only fights this hard when real transformation is occurring. The old patterns only scream this loudly when they sense their power is truly threatened. What feels like regression is often the darkness before dawn, the storm before the clearing. But navigating this inner weather requires support that the codependent empath has rarely allowed themselves to seek. They who have spent their lives being the rock for others must learn to lean, to ask for help, to admit that they cannot heal alone. This admission feels like betrayal of everything they have believed about themselves, yet it is the very admission that begins to set them free. The healing journey demands witnesses, those who can see the empath's authentic self, even when they cannot see it themselves. Not more people to rescue or be rescued by, but souls who can hold space for the messy, uncertain, gloriously imperfect process of becoming real. These witnesses do not try to fix or save or manage the empath's experience. They simply bear witness to it, reflecting back the truth of who the empath is beneath all the roles and masks and carefully constructed personas. Finding such witnesses is not easy for the codependent empath. They have attracted into their lives those who need them, not those who see them. They have surrounded themselves with the wounded and the seeking, the chaotic and the needy. Their entire social ecosystem has been built around their function as emotional first responder, therapeutic container, ever-available source of support and understanding. When they begin to change, this ecosystem becomes unstable. Some people fall away naturally, no longer finding what they seek in the empath's presence. Others resist more actively, using guilt, manipulation, and emotional pressure to pull the empath back into familiar patterns. They may accuse the empath of abandoning them, of becoming cold and selfish, of betraying the very love they once shared. These accusations cut deep because they activate the empath's deepest fear, that their true self is indeed unlovable, that their worth truly does depend upon their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others. The temptation to return to old patterns becomes almost overwhelming. It would be so much easier to simply go back to being what everyone expects, to resume the familiar role of emotional caretaker, to sacrifice their emerging authenticity on the altar of others' comfort. This is the crucial moment, the dark night of the soul, where the empath must choose between the familiar prison of codependence and the uncertain freedom of authentic being. They must learn to tolerate being misunderstood, being seen as selfish, being accused of changing in ways that make others uncomfortable. They must develop the capacity to disappoint others without taking responsibility for their disappointment. This capacity does not come naturally. It must be cultivated through practice, through small acts of self-loyalty, through choosing their own truth, even when it costs them the approval of others. Each time they say no without explaining themselves into exhaustion, each time they refuse to absorb someone else's emotional chaos, each time they choose their own peace over someone else's crisis, they strengthen the muscle of authentic selfhood. The process is often lonely. The empath discovers that many of the people they thought were friends were actually emotional clients, drawn to their availability rather than their authenticity. They realize that much of what they experienced as love was appreciation for services rendered, gratitude for being the emotional regulator in relationships where others refuse to regulate themselves. This recognition brings grief, deep, soul-level mourning for the connections that were never real, for the love that was never unconditional, for the years spent believing that their worth was measured by their usefulness. The empath must allow themselves to feel this grief fully, to honor the loss of illusions that once provided comfort, to acknowledge the pain of seeing clearly what was always true but too threatening to recognize. Yet within this grief lies liberation, for the empath can no longer pretend that giving themselves away is the same as being loved. They can no longer maintain the exhausting performance of being endlessly available, endlessly understanding, endlessly accommodating. They can no longer sacrifice their truth on the altar of others' emotional comfort. The space that opens when these illusions fall away is initially terrifying. Who is the empath when they are not needed? What is their value when it is not measured by their usefulness? What does their life look like when it is not organized around the needs and crises of others? These questions hover in the emptiness like vultures circling the places where old certainties once lived. But gradually, slowly, something new begins to emerge in this space. Not the frantic energy of codependence, but the quiet power of authentic presence. Not the desperate need to be needed, but the simple desire to be real. Not the compulsive giving that leaves nothing for the self, but the conscious choice to share from fullness rather than emptiness. The empath discovers that they have emotions of their own, desires that belong to no one else, dreams that have nothing to do with healing or helping or fixing anyone. They find interests they had forgotten, passions they had buried beneath years of attending to everyone else's needs. They remember who they were before they learned that love meant disappearing into others. This remembering is not always pleasant. The empath may discover anger they have never allowed themselves to feel, resentment they have never permitted themselves to acknowledge, disappointment they have never dared to express. They may find that beneath their endless compassion lies a well of rage at having been taken for granted, used up, treated as a resource rather than a person. This anger is not a mistake or a failure of spiritual development. It is information, pointing toward boundaries that were violated, needs that were ignored, truths that were silenced. The empath must learn to welcome this anger as a teacher, to listen to its message without immediately trying to transcend or transform it into something more palatable. For the anger carries within it the seed of healthy selfishness, the fierce protectiveness that guards authentic being. It is the fire that burns away what is false, the force that says no to what diminishes and yes to what nourishes. Without this anger, the empath remains vulnerable to the same patterns that created their codependence in the first place. Learning to befriend their anger requires the empath to question everything they have been taught about goodness, spirituality, and love. They have been conditioned to believe that anger is unspiritual, that boundaries are unloving, that self-focus is selfish. They have learned to equate niceness with goodness, accommodation with love, self-sacrifice with virtue. But true goodness sometimes requires fierceness. Real love demands honesty, even when it is uncomfortable. Authentic virtue asks for wholeness rather than self-erasure. The empath must learn to distinguish between the false spirituality that demands they remain small and accommodating and the true spirituality that calls them toward their full humanity. This distinction is not academic. It shows up in daily choices, moment-by-moment decisions about how to respond to the world around them. When someone tries to dump their emotional chaos into the empath's lap, do they automatically absorb it, or do they gently redirect it back to its owner? When faced with someone's disappointment at their boundaries, do they immediately cave, or do they hold firm in loving detachment? These micro-choices accumulate over time, creating new neural pathways, new habitual responses, new ways of being in relationship. The empath slowly learns to trust their own perceptions, to honor their own needs, to believe that their authentic self is worthy of love and respect. The transformation is not complete when the empath simply learns to say no or establish boundaries. These are important skills, but they are only the beginning. The deeper work involves developing what might be called sacred selfishness, the understanding that caring for their own soul is not separate from but essential to their ability to truly serve others. This sacred selfishness looks different from the wounded narcissism that demands constant attention and validation. It is not about taking more than one gives or manipulating others for personal gain. It is about recognizing that they cannot pour from an empty cup, that they cannot give what they do not possess, that their own wholeness is a gift not only to themselves, but to everyone whose life they touch. The empath who learns to fill their own cup first discovers that they have more to offer, not less. Their compassion becomes sustainable rather than depleting. Their presence becomes nourishing rather than draining. Their love flows from abundance rather than need, from choice rather than compulsion. This is the paradox of authentic empathy. It requires a strong sense of self to truly serve others. The empath who knows where they end and others begin can offer genuine support without losing themselves in the process. The one who has learned to feel their own emotions can witness others' pain without absorbing it. The person who has claimed their own worth can love others without needing to be needed. But this transformation challenges not only the empath, but everyone in their orbit. Family members who have grown comfortable with having an emotional shock absorber must learn to process their own feelings. Friends who have relied on the empath's endless availability must find other sources of support. Partners who have never had to consider the empath's needs must suddenly learn to see them as a separate person with their own desires and boundaries. The resistance to this change can be fierce. Those who have benefited from the empath's codependence often escalate their demands when they sense the old patterns shifting. They may create crises designed to pull the empath back into familiar roles. They may use guilt, manipulation, or emotional blackmail to maintain the status quo. They may threaten to leave, to withdraw their love, to find someone else who will give them what the empath is no longer willing to provide. These threats activate every abandonment fear the empath has ever carried. The terror of being alone, of being unloved, of being seen as selfish or uncaring. The old patterns whisper seductive lies. It would be so much easier to just give in, to go back to being what everyone expects, to sacrifice this emerging authenticity for the comfort of familiar dysfunction. This is the ultimate test of the empath's commitment to their own wholeness. Can they tolerate being misunderstood? Can they survive the withdrawal of approval from those who love them only when they remain small? Can they trust that real love will find them when they finally dare to show up as they truly are? The answer to these questions cannot be given from the outside. Each empath must discover it for themselves through the lived experience of choosing authenticity over accommodation, truth over comfort, wholeness over the illusion of harmony. They must learn that they can survive disappointment, their own and others, that they can bear the weight of being seen as selfish by those who benefited from their selflessness. The path through this fire is not one that can be walked with maps drawn by others. Each empath must descend into their own underworld, must face their own dragons, must confront the particular constellation of wounds that created their need to disappear into others. Yet there are patterns that emerge, archetypal themes that repeat across the landscape of this transformation. One of the most challenging aspects of breaking free from codependence is what I call the guilt eclipse. The moment the empath begins to prioritize their own needs, to set boundaries that protect their energy, to choose themselves in ways they never have before, a shadow falls across their consciousness. This shadow whispers familiar refrains. You are being selfish. You are abandoning those who need you. You are betraying the very love you claim to embody. This guilt is not rational. It does not respond to logic or reasoning. It is primal, cellular, woven into the very fabric of their being through years of conditioning. The empath has been trained to believe that their worth is conditional upon their usefulness, that love must be earned through sacrifice, that their own needs are somehow less important than everyone else's. But this guilt is also information. It points toward the places where the empath has been colonized by others' expectations, where their authentic self has been buried beneath layers of adaptation and accommodation. The guilt is the cry of a false self that knows its days are numbered, the desperate protest of patterns that have outlived their usefulness. Learning to move through this guilt without being paralyzed by it requires what might be called archetypal courage. This is not the courage of the warrior who conquers external enemies, but the courage of the mystic who faces the demons within. It is the willingness to be misunderstood, to be seen as changed or different, or somehow less giving than before. The empath discovers that guilt has been their constant companion, their internal compass that always pointed away from their own needs and toward the needs of others. They realize they have never made a decision without first calculating its impact on everyone else, never chosen something for themselves without immediately feeling the weight of others' potential disappointment. This recognition can be overwhelming. To see how completely they have abandoned themselves, how thoroughly they have learned to prioritize everyone else's emotional weather above their own. The depth of self-betrayal becomes visible, and with it comes a grief so profound it threatens to drown them in its depths. Yet this grief, too, is sacred. It is the mourning of what was lost, the honoring of the self that was sacrificed on the altar of others' comfort. The empath must allow themselves to feel this loss fully, to acknowledge the years spent in exile from their own truth, to grieve the relationships that were built on their willingness to be less than they are. Through this grief, something unexpected begins to emerge. Not the bitter hardness that comes from closing the heart, but a fierce tenderness toward their own wounded places. The empath begins to feel protective of their emerging authenticity, guarding it like a mother guards her newborn child. They develop what I call discerning love, the ability to care deeply while maintaining clear boundaries about what they will and will not accept. This discernment extends beyond romantic relationships into every area of their lives. They begin to notice which friendships drain them and which nourish them. They become aware of family dynamics that require their constant emotional labor to maintain stability. They recognize work environments that exploit their willingness to take on more than their share of responsibility. The process of disentangling from these patterns is neither quick nor easy. The empath often finds themselves caught between worlds, no longer willing to play their old roles, but not yet comfortable with the uncertainty of not knowing who they are without those roles. They may experience what feels like an identity crisis, a period of profound disorientation where nothing feels familiar or certain. This disorientation is not pathology, but initiation. It is the necessary chaos that precedes authentic rebirth. The old self must die completely before the new self can emerge, and death is rarely comfortable, even when it is chosen. The empath must learn to tolerate this uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing who they are becoming. During this liminal time, the empath often experiences what I call empathy vertigo. They have been so accustomed to feeling everything for everyone that when they begin to withdraw their emotional tendrils from others' inner worlds, they feel dizzy, unmoored, lost. They may worry that they are becoming cold or unfeeling, that they are losing their gift, that they are somehow betraying their true nature. But what they are actually losing is their compulsion to feel for others. What they are releasing is the exhausting burden of being responsible for everyone else's emotional state. What they are letting go of is the prison of codependence disguised as compassion. Their gift of empathy remains, but it begins to transform from something that happens to them into something they choose to engage. This transformation requires the development of what might be called conscious empathy. Instead of automatically absorbing whatever emotional energy surrounds them, the empath learns to create a pause between perception and absorption. They begin to ask themselves, is this feeling mine or theirs? Do I need to take this on, or can I witness it without owning it? What would it look like to care without carrying? These questions become daily practices, moments of mindfulness that gradually shift the empath's relationship to their sensitivity. They discover that they can feel deeply without losing themselves in the feeling, that they can care profoundly without taking responsibility for outcomes beyond their control. The development of this conscious empathy often reveals the extent to which the empath's gift has been weaponized against them. They begin to see how others have used their sensitivity to manipulate them, how their compassion has been exploited by those who refuse to take responsibility for their own emotional lives. They recognize the ways in which their willingness to feel for others has enabled dysfunction rather than healing. This recognition can bring anger, and this anger is both necessary and healing. It is the fire that burns away what is false, the force that says no to what diminishes and yes to what honors their true nature. The empath must learn to welcome this anger as an ally, to listen to its wisdom without immediately trying to transform it into something more palatable. For many empaths, anger feels dangerous, threatening, unspiritual. They have been conditioned to believe that good people do not get angry, that spiritual people transcend such base emotions, that their role is to absorb anger rather than express it. But this conditioning is part of what keeps them trapped in codependence. Healthy anger is not rage or violence or the desire to harm. It is the natural response to boundary violations, the appropriate reaction to being treated as less than human. It is the energy that fuels necessary change, the force that protects what is sacred. Without access to their anger, the empath remains vulnerable to the same patterns that created their codependence. Learning to feel and express anger appropriately requires the empath to challenge everything they have been taught about being good, nice, spiritual, loving. They must question the voices that tell them their anger is unacceptable, that their boundaries are unloving, that their needs are selfish. They must learn to distinguish between the false spirituality that demands they remain small and the true spirituality that calls them toward wholeness. This process often involves confronting the people and systems that benefited from their emotional labor, the family members who expect them to absorb everyone's chaos, the friends who call only when they need something, the partners who have grown comfortable with having their every need anticipated and met, the employers who rely on their willingness to work beyond reasonable limits. These confrontations are rarely comfortable. The empath may find themselves accused of being selfish, cold, changed, different. They may be told they are abandoning their responsibilities, betraying their nature, becoming someone unrecognizable. These accusations cut deep because they activate the empath's deepest fears about their own worth and lovability. But these accusations also reveal the truth about many of the relationships in the empath's life. When people react with anger or withdrawal to the empath's emerging boundaries, they are revealing that their connection was conditional upon the empath's willingness to remain small, available, accommodating. They are showing that their love was transactional, based on what the empath provided rather than who the empath truly is. This revelation, while painful, is also liberating. The empath can no longer pretend that relationships built on their self-sacrifice are healthy or sustainable. They can no longer maintain the illusion that being needed is the same as being loved. They can no longer convince themselves that their worth is measured by their usefulness to others. The space that opens when these illusions fall away is initially terrifying. The empath has organized their entire life around the needs of others, and when they begin to withdraw that focus, they may feel lost, purposeless, unsure of their own value. They may wonder who they are when they are not needed, what their life means when it is not centered on service to others. This existential questioning is part of the individuation process, the journey toward becoming a whole and authentic person rather than a collection of adaptive responses to others' needs. It requires the empath to discover their own desires, their own dreams, their own sense of purpose that exists independent of their usefulness to others. This discovery often happens slowly, in small moments of awareness. The empath may notice that they enjoy certain activities when no one else is around to please or accommodate. They may find themselves drawn to experiences that serve no purpose other than their own enjoyment. They may discover opinions and preferences they never knew they had because they were always too busy adapting to what others wanted. These moments of self-discovery can be both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because they offer glimpses of an authentic self that has been buried for so long. Terrifying because they challenge everything the empath has believed about their identity and purpose. Who are they if not the helper, the healer, the one who puts everyone else first? The answer to this question cannot be found through thinking or analysis. It must be lived, experienced, discovered through the daily practice of choosing authenticity over accommodation, truth over comfort, wholeness over the illusion of harmony. The empath must learn to trust that they have value beyond their usefulness, worth beyond their willingness to sacrifice themselves for others. This trust does not come easily. It must be built through repeated experiences of being loved for who they are rather than what they do, of being valued for their authentic self rather than their adaptive personas. It requires the empath to risk being seen in their full humanity, including their flaws, their needs, their imperfections. The journey toward this trust often involves periods of intense loneliness. As the empath withdraws from relationships that were built on codependence, they may find themselves with fewer connections but deeper ones. They may discover that many of the people they thought were friends were actually emotional clients, drawn to their availability rather than their authenticity. This loneliness is not a sign of failure, but a necessary part of the process. It creates space for new kinds of relationships to emerge, connections based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than need and accommodation. The empath learns to prefer the honesty of solitude to the false intimacy of codependence. In this solitude, the empath begins to develop a relationship with themselves that they may never have had before. They learn to enjoy their own company, to trust their own perceptions, to value their own thoughts and feelings. They discover that they can be whole and complete without needing to merge with others, that they can love without losing themselves in the process. This self-relationship becomes the foundation for all other relationships. When the empath knows and values themselves, they can enter connections from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, choice rather than compulsion, strength rather than need. They can offer their gifts freely, without depleting themselves, love without losing themselves, serve without sacrificing themselves. The transformation is not linear. The empath may find themselves cycling through periods of clarity and confusion, strength and vulnerability, boundaries and boundarylessness. They may have moments of profound insight, followed by days of falling back into old patterns. This cycling is not failure, but the natural rhythm of deep change. Each cycle brings new awareness, new opportunities to choose differently, new chances to practice the skills of authentic relating. The empath gradually learns to catch themselves earlier when they begin to slip into codependent patterns, to redirect their energy before they become completely entangled in others' emotional dramas. They develop what might be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to remain centered in their own truth even when surrounded by chaos or conflict. They learn to offer compassion without taking on others' pain, to provide support without taking responsibility for others' choices, to love without losing themselves in the process. This emotional sovereignty is not coldness or detachment. It is the mature capacity to remain connected to their own center while engaging authentically with others. It is the difference between empathy and enmeshment, between compassion and codependence, between love and addiction to being needed. The empath who achieves this sovereignty discovers that their gift becomes more powerful, not less. When they are no longer compelled to absorb every emotion in their environment, they can choose when and how to engage their empathic abilities. When they are no longer depleted by constant emotional labor, they have more energy to offer genuine support when it is truly needed and welcomed. They learn to distinguish between their calling to serve and their compulsion to fix. They understand that their role is not to save others from their own experiences, but to bear witness to those experiences with love and presence. They discover that the greatest gift they can offer is not their sacrifice but their wholeness, not their emptiness but their fullness, not their need to be needed but their choice to love. This understanding transforms not only their relationships but their entire approach to life. The empath begins to see their sensitivity not as a burden to be managed, but as a gift to be honored. They learn to protect their energy not through withdrawal, but through discernment, not through hardness, but through wise boundaries. They discover that saying no to what drains them creates space to say yes to what truly serves. They find that disappointing some people is the price of honoring their authentic self. They learn that they cannot please everyone, and that trying to do so is a betrayal of their own soul. The empath who completes this journey does not become selfish or uncaring. They become authentic. Their compassion flows from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than need. They offer their gifts freely but not indiscriminately, love deeply but not destructively, serve willingly but not compulsively. They become what they were always meant to be, not a sponge for others' emotions, but a mirror for their own truth, not a sacrifice on the altar of others' comfort, but a whole human being capable of genuine intimacy and authentic connection. They learn that their sensitivity is not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be honored, not a burden to be carried, but a gift to be shared wisely and well. This transformation, while profound, does not happen in isolation. It occurs within the context of a world that profits from the empath's unconsciousness, that benefits from their willingness to absorb what others refuse to process. We live in a culture that celebrates the giver, while rarely questioning what creates the need for such endless giving. We praise the selfless while remaining blind to the systems that demand such self-erasure. The empath who awakens begins to see these larger patterns, these collective agreements that keep sensitive souls trapped in cycles of depletion and service. They recognize that their individual codependence is part of a broader tapestry of dysfunction, woven from threads of patriarchal conditioning, capitalist exploitation, and spiritual bypassing disguised as enlightenment. In families, the empath often serves as the emotional thermostat, unconsciously recruited to regulate the temperature of everyone else's feelings. They become the repository for unprocessed grief, unexpressed anger, unacknowledged fear. Their hypervigilance becomes a family resource, their sensitivity a tool for maintaining the illusion of harmony while dysfunction festers beneath the surface. In workplaces, they become the ones who stay late to finish projects that others abandon, who absorb the stress of unrealistic deadlines without complaint, who smooth over conflicts created by those who refuse to take responsibility for their own emotional labor. Their conscientiousness becomes a liability, their dedication an invitation for exploitation. In romantic partnerships, they often find themselves cast as the emotional container for partners who have never learned to hold their own inner weather. They become the translator of unspoken needs, the anticipator of unexpressed desires, the manager of emotions that their partners refuse to acknowledge or address. These patterns are not accidents, they are the predictable result of a world that has forgotten the sacred nature of sensitivity, that treats empathy as a resource to be consumed rather than a gift to be honoured. The empath who begins to see these dynamics clearly often experiences what might be called righteous rage, a fierce anger at having been used up by systems and people who mistake their sensitivity for weakness. This rage is not something to be transcended or spiritualized away. It is fuel for the necessary revolution that must occur within the empath's life. It is the fire that burns away what is false, the force that demands better treatment, the energy that insists on authentic reciprocity in relationships. But this rage must be channeled wisely, transformed from reactive fury into conscious choice. The empath cannot explode at everyone who has taken advantage of their sensitivity. Such explosions often serve only to confirm others' beliefs that the empath was unstable all along, that their newfound boundaries are evidence of breakdown rather than breakthrough. Instead, the empath must learn what I call strategic withdrawal. This is not passive-aggressive punishment, but conscious disengagement from patterns that no longer serve their highest good. It is the quiet revolution of no longer being available for emotional dumping, no longer absorbing the chaos that others refuse to process, no longer sacrificing their peace for others' comfort. This withdrawal often triggers what might be called the vacuum effect. When the empath stops filling the space with their endless availability, that space becomes visible to everyone who had grown comfortable with their services. Suddenly, the emotional labor that was invisible when the empath performed it becomes glaringly obvious in its absence. Family members may discover they don't know how to process their own emotions without the empath's constant mediation. Friends may realize they have no idea how to handle their own crises without the empath's immediate response. Partners may find themselves face to face with feelings they have spent years avoiding, emotions they had grown comfortable having the empath carry for them. The responses to this vacuum are often intense and sometimes ugly. Those who benefited from the empath's unconsciousness may escalate their demands, create more dramatic crises, or resort to manipulation tactics designed to pull the empath back into familiar patterns. They may accuse the empath of being selfish, cold, or fundamentally changed in ways that feel threatening to the established order. These responses reveal the truth about many of the relationships in the empath's life. When people react with anger to boundaries, they are showing that their connection was conditional. When they withdraw their affection in response to the empath's emerging authenticity, they are demonstrating that their love was transactional. When they escalate their neediness in response to the empath's decreased availability, they are revealing that they saw the empath as a resource rather than a person. This revelation, while painful, is also liberating. The empath can no longer maintain illusions about the nature of these connections. They can no longer pretend that relationships built on their self-sacrifice are healthy or sustainable. They can no longer convince themselves that being used is the same as being loved. The grief that accompanies this recognition is profound. It is the mourning of what was never real, the acknowledgement of years spent believing in connections that existed only as long as the empath remained small and available. It is the sorrow of recognizing how thoroughly they had abandoned themselves in service of others' comfort. But within this grief lies the seed of authentic relationship. When the empath stops trying to be everything to everyone, space opens for genuine connections to emerge. When they stop performing the role of emotional caretaker, they create room for others to show up as equals rather than clients. When they cease to be the solution to everyone else's problems, they invite others to discover their own capacity for growth and healing. The relationships that survive this transformation are often the ones worth having. They are connections that can withstand honesty, that celebrate authenticity, that grow stronger when both people show up as whole human beings rather than fragmented roles. These relationships do not depend on the empath's willingness to be less than they are, but instead are nourished by their commitment to being fully themselves. Yet finding such relationships often requires the empath to venture into unfamiliar territory. They must learn to recognize the difference between genuine interest and emotional neediness, between authentic connection and the seductive pull of being needed. They must develop the capacity to be attracted to wholeness rather than brokenness, to health rather than dysfunction, to those who offer reciprocity rather than endless need. This shift in attraction patterns is often one of the most challenging aspects of the empath's transformation. They have been conditioned to feel most needed, most valuable, most alive in the presence of chaos and crisis. The calm stability of healthy people may initially feel boring, unfamiliar, even suspicious to someone who has learned to equate intensity with intimacy. The empath must retrain their nervous system to recognize peace as desirable rather than threatening, to experience calm as nourishing rather than empty. They must learn that relationships can be based on joy and growth rather than crisis and rescue, that love can feel safe and stable rather than dramatic and consuming. This retraining often involves grieving the addiction to intensity that has shaped their relational patterns. The empath may discover that they have become accustomed to the adrenaline rush of emotional crisis, the feeling of importance that comes from being the one who can handle what others cannot. They may find themselves missing the familiar chaos, even as they recognize its destructive nature. Learning to appreciate the quiet rhythms of healthy relationship requires patience and practice. The empath must develop tolerance for what might initially feel like boredom, recognizing it as the nervous system's adjustment to the absence of constant stimulation. They must learn to find meaning and connection in small gestures of care rather than grand dramas of rescue and salvation. This adjustment period often involves what might be called intimacy vertigo. The empath has been so accustomed to bonding through crisis that they may feel disoriented when asked to connect through simple presence and authentic sharing. They may worry that they have nothing to offer if they are not solving someone's problems, that they are uninteresting if they are not indispensable. But this worry reveals the depth of their conditioning, the extent to which they have confused their worth with their usefulness. The healing journey requires them to discover that they have value simply by virtue of existing, that their presence is a gift even when they are not fixing or helping or carrying anyone else's burdens. This discovery often happens in moments of quiet connection, when the empath allows themselves to be seen without performing any particular role. It may occur in conversations where they share their own thoughts and feelings without immediately turning the focus back to others. It might emerge in activities they enjoy for their own sake rather than for how they serve someone else's needs. These moments of authentic being can feel revolutionary to someone who has spent their life hiding behind the mask of the helper. To be witnessed and appreciated simply for who they are rather than what they do challenges everything they have believed about their own worth. It opens doorways to ways of being they may never have imagined possible. The empath begins to understand that their sensitivity, when conscious and boundaried, is indeed a gift to the world. But it is a gift that must be offered from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from love rather than fear. They learn that they can serve others most effectively when they are not sacrificing themselves in the process. This understanding transforms their approach to helping and healing. Instead of automatically taking on others' pain, they learn to hold space for it without absorbing it. Instead of rushing to fix every problem they encounter, they develop the wisdom to discern when their help is truly needed and welcome. Instead of depleting themselves through endless giving, they learn to offer their gifts sustainably. They discover that presence is often more healing than advice, that witnessing is sometimes more valuable than intervention, that allowing others to struggle with their own challenges can be more loving than rescuing them from those struggles. They learn that their role is not to save others from their human experience, but to accompany them through it with compassion and respect. This shift requires the empath to develop what might be called sacred selfishness, the understanding that caring for their own soul is not separate from, but essential to their ability to serve others authentically. They must learn to see self-care not as indulgence, but as responsibility, not as selfishness, but as stewardship of the gifts they have been given. Sacred selfishness looks different from narcissistic self-absorption. It is not about taking more than one gives or manipulating others for personal gain. It is about recognizing that they cannot offer what they do not possess, that they cannot give from an empty well, that their own wholeness is a prerequisite for authentic service. This recognition often requires the empath to confront their martyrdom complex, the subtle addiction to sacrifice that has shaped their identity. They must examine the ways in which suffering has become their currency, pain their proof of virtue, self-denial, their claim to spiritual superiority. They must question whether their endless giving truly serves others or simply enables dysfunction while feeding their own need to be needed. This examination can be uncomfortable because it reveals the shadow side of empathy, the ways in which even the most seemingly selfless acts can be motivated by unconscious needs for validation, control, or significance. The empath must face the possibility that their helping has sometimes been a form of hindering, their rescuing a prevention of others' growth, their caretaking a subtle form of domination. This shadow work is essential because it frees the empath from the compulsive quality that characterizes codependent behavior. When they no longer need to be needed, their helping becomes truly voluntary. When they no longer fear abandonment, their boundaries become genuinely protective rather than reactively defensive. When they no longer measure their worth by their usefulness, their service becomes an expression of love rather than a desperate bid for acceptance. The empath who completes this inner work discovers that their gift of sensitivity becomes more refined, more powerful, more genuinely helpful. They develop what might be called discerning empathy, the ability to feel with others without losing themselves in the feeling, to sense what is needed without automatically providing it, to witness pain without taking responsibility for healing it. This discernment extends beyond individual relationships into their engagement with the suffering of the world. The awakened empath does not become callous to global pain, but they do become more strategic in their response to it. They learn to choose their battles wisely, to focus their energy where it can be most effective, to serve from their unique gifts, rather than trying to be everything to everyone. They may discover that their calling is not to absorb the world's pain, but to model what wholeness looks like, not to rescue others from their darkness, but to shine their own light steadily. They might find that their greatest service is simply being authentically themselves, demonstrating that it is possible to be sensitive without being depleted, caring without being consumed, loving without being lost. This modeling is itself a form of healing work, though it may not look like the traditional helping roles the empath once inhabited. By living as an integrated, boundaried, authentic person, they give others permission to do the same. By refusing to enable dysfunction, they create space for others to take responsibility for their own healing. By honoring their own needs, they teach others that self-care is not selfish but essential. The ripple effects of this transformation extend far beyond the empath's immediate circle. Children who grow up with an awakened empath learn different patterns of relating, seeing that love does not require self-sacrifice, that boundaries are expressions of care rather than rejection, that authenticity is more valuable than accommodation. Partners discover what it means to be in relationship with someone who is whole rather than fragmented, present rather than depleted, choosing rather than compulsive. Communities benefit when empaths stop absorbing dysfunction and start modeling health. Workplaces become more functional when sensitive people refuse to carry more than their share of emotional labor. Families heal when the designated emotional caretaker steps out of that role and invites others to take responsibility for their own inner weather. But this transformation is not without its costs. The empath may lose relationships that were built on their willingness to be less than they are. They may disappoint people who had grown comfortable with their endless availability. They may be accused of selfishness by those who benefited from their self-sacrifice. These losses are part of the process, necessary pruning that makes room for new growth. The empath learns to grieve what was never real while celebrating what is becoming authentic. They discover that they would rather be alone with their truth than surrounded by people who love only their performance. The path through this transformation is not linear. There will be moments of backsliding, times when the old patterns feel seductive in their familiarity. There will be days when the empath questions whether this journey toward authenticity is worth the pain it sometimes brings. There will be nights when the loneliness feels overwhelming, when the old ways of being seem easier, even if they were ultimately destructive. These moments of doubt are not failures, but part of the process. They are opportunities to recommit to the path of wholeness, to remember why the journey began, to choose authenticity once again, even when it feels difficult. Each time the empath makes this choice, they strengthen the neural pathways of self-respect. They deepen the grooves of healthy relationship. They move closer to the person they were always meant to be. The empath who perseveres through this transformation discovers something remarkable. They do not lose their capacity for deep feeling, but they gain the ability to feel without drowning. They do not become cold or uncaring, but they develop the strength to care without being consumed. They do not lose their sensitivity, but they learn to use it as a tool rather than being used by it as a weapon against themselves. They become what might be called a conscious empath, someone who can feel deeply while remaining centered, who can offer compassion without depleting themselves, who can witness pain without absorbing it. They learn that true empathy requires not the dissolution of boundaries, but their conscious maintenance, not the abandonment of self, but its full embodiment. This conscious empathy becomes a gift, not only to themselves, but to everyone whose life they touch. They model what it looks like to be sensitive without being fragile, caring without being codependent, loving without being lost. They show others that it is possible to feel deeply while living fully, to serve authentically while honoring one's own needs. The journey from codependent empathy to conscious empathy is perhaps one of the most important transformations a sensitive soul can undergo. It is the difference between being victimized by one's gifts and being empowered by them, between drowning in the ocean of human emotion and learning to surf its waves with grace and skill. This transformation serves not only the individual empath, but the collective healing of our world. As more sensitive souls learn to honor their gifts while maintaining their boundaries, as more empaths discover how to serve from fullness rather than emptiness, we move closer to a world where sensitivity is celebrated rather than exploited, where empathy is conscious rather than compulsive, where love is expressed through wholeness rather than sacrifice. The empath's journey toward authenticity is ultimately a journey toward love, real love that honors both self and other, that creates rather than depletes, that liberates rather than enslaves. It is a path that leads not away from service, but towards service that is truly sustainable. Not away from caring, but toward caring that does not consume the carer. In the end, the awakened empath discovers that their greatest gift to the world is not their willingness to absorb its pain, but their commitment to their own wholeness. They learn that they can love most deeply when they love from a place of fullness, that they can serve most effectively when they serve from choice rather than compulsion, that they can heal most powerfully when they refuse to be wounded in the process. This is the true path of the empath, not to be consumed by the darkness they encounter, but to transform it through the alchemy of their own integrated being. Not to disappear into others' stories, but to remain firmly rooted in their own truth while witnessing others with compassion. Not to save the world through sacrifice, but to serve it through the radical act of being authentically, unapologetically, completely themselves. The world needs conscious empaths, those who have learned to feel without drowning, to care without being consumed, to love without losing themselves. It needs those who have discovered that the greatest healing comes not from taking on others' wounds, but from modeling what wholeness looks like. It needs those who understand that sensitivity is not a liability to be managed, but a gift to be honored. Not a burden to be carried, but a light to be shared. The empath who completes this journey becomes a beacon for others still trapped in the maze of codependence. They show by their very existence that another way is possible, that sensitivity and strength can coexist, that empathy and authenticity can dance together in beautiful harmony. They prove that it is possible to care deeply while living fully, to feel everything while losing nothing of themselves in the process.